My story within a story, I would say, started in high school. And I took my first AP psychology class and was learning about all the different, diagnoses and things like that. And I came across borderline personality disorder. And if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially characterized by very intense emotions, black and white thinking. So things are either all good or all bad, and it can kind of switch back and forth very quickly. And that causes turbulence in relationships and anxiety about abandonment and relationships ending. And so I read through these things. And of course, as a teenager, you experience a lot of those things, in general. I think we know that the hallmark of being a teenager is those heightened emotions with your hormones and everything. But so when I read it, I was like, oh my gosh, that is me. Like this diagnosis, this is me. And I feel like for a lot of people that would be like, oh, like, no, this is bad. But for me, I read it and was like, oh my gosh, this is like, it feels like putting on glasses for the first time. Like understanding the way I'm feeling in this context. And so I went to my next psychiatrist appointment, who I had a good, fine relationship with. And I brought it up in the most, educated way that I knew how at the time at 17, 18, and said, I just came across this. It feels like it fits me. What do you think about this? And if her response had just been like, I hear you, but I can't diagnose you yet. You're still a teenager. We probably will be having a totally different conversation. But instead it did not go quite that easy. And I had what I now generally call a borderline meltdown in her office. So she basically was like, I can't diagnose you. You're under 18. Those are like the hallmark experiences of being a teenager. I'm not going to diagnose you with this. And my black and white thinking switched very quickly of being, ready to advocate for myself and talk about what I was experiencing in a rational way. And I just lost it. And I started like screaming and crying and, yelling at her and being like, you're not hearing me. You like don't care about my feelings. I'm struggling. I'm suffering. And like, if that is not just like the epitome of a borderline meltdown, I don't know what else is. So it's just thinking back, it's really funny to know for myself that like in that moment, yes, I was struggling so much, but I was literally showing the exact signs of what I was trying to communicate that I felt was wrong with me. And so I didn't get that diagnosis then, obviously, because you can't when you're a teenager. So I kind of just continued, they were like, well, you have depression and anxiety, those kinds of things. And I went on with those diagnoses, went to college, started going for clinical mental health work, and, learning more about those kinds of skills and just integrating the general skills into my life. And it wasn't until I guess I kind of lost, some of the structure that comes with being in high school. You're going to school like a pretty long day. You're doing activities after, you're living with your parents, things like that. That gave me some of the structure to just, keep doing what I was supposed to be doing. And as I got into college and you have that freedom, I started to indulge my emotional impulses more, until it got to a point where I was then, running from the consequences and having those kinds of borderline meltdowns where I was really struggling and feeling a lot of anxiety and fear and grief and pain. And so it wasn't until actually my primary care doctor recommended that I try out the women's partial program at Butler Hospital. And so being in the clinical field, I had heard about DBT, but I didn't know too much about it. And so when she said that, I was like, okay, that's interesting. A women's program, like I feel safe with other women. That feels like a good fit. And that was absolutely life-changing. So the women's partial program at Butler, shout out to them. They are my happy place in my mind. I love them so much. The environment is just amazing. And the DBT skills that they teach you are so invaluable across the board. And so I'll circle back to the DBT part, but that was kind of where I got my understanding of what it meant for me to have borderline personality disorder. And so again, a little bit about what it's like is it feels like basically that like people say the volume knob on your emotions is turned up all the way. Or like if you have like a scrape on your hand, like if you like touch it, it hurts. Like you have exposed nerves. And it's just that like really intense, heightened emotionality. And so I lived with that for forever. And then, you know, to see it through this lens of borderline, in some ways it has, you know, a very negative stigma, but my experience with it was it's who I am. You know, it's the way I've always felt my feelings. It's part of what makes me who I am. And so getting like that diagnosis opened a new door to me understanding and being more aware of other people's understanding. So it changed from me trying to understand myself to like my clinical perspective of how I was seeing other people understand borderline. So, you know, I would go to work and in my classes and I hear like the saddest things that really hurt my heart to hear people say about borderline, of, you know, the idea that we are manipulative, toxic, abusers, things like that from a personal perspective, whether it's a friendship or a relationship, or from like a clinical perspective, hearing people say like, oh, you don't want to take borderline patients, like they're gonna go crazy on you, all those kinds of things. I've heard that firsthand from just across the board. And it's so hurtful because it falls under a category of personality disorders. And I think that part in itself is super interesting. And I guess a foundational piece of what I am talking about here today, which is that the idea of a personality disorder, when you're thinking from like A equals B, B equals C, A equals C, if your personality is, you know, who you are from, you know, your personality, your temperament, that's who you are from the day you're born until the day you die. We know that from a personality theory perspective and personality psychology, that is who you are. And so to describe your personality as disordered, it's a really weird feeling to know that like that's who I am. So if my personality is who I am and my personality is disordered, am I a disordered person? Is that just like innately who I am? Is there something wrong with me in general? But I don't view it that way, and I don't think that that's a helpful way for like anyone to view it in general. And I think that has kind of informed my understanding of diagnosis versus treatment versus symptoms, and how all those things are really relational. So it's not just a one-way street. It's not I have X symptoms or I have X disorder, so I show Y symptoms, so I get Z diagnosis and treatment. You know, it doesn't necessarily need to go like that. And I think to try to put it on that track is more of a disservice to people, because like I said, way back when, if my doctor's response had been, I can't diagnose you, but you're telling me you're struggling with this black and white thinking, these turbulent feelings, here's DBT, which is all about learning balance on a variety of fronts. I would have had those skills way back when, instead of having to wait until getting the diagnosis allowed me to get that kind of specific treatment. And it's like, I kind of think of DBT almost as like a vitamin for your brain, like a behavioral vitamin, basically. So like you would never be like, oh, I don't want the benefits of like a daily multivitamin. I don't want those. And you would never say like the components of DBT are mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. And I don't think anyone would ever say like, I don't want interpersonal effectiveness. I want turbulent relationships, or I don't want to know how to handle myself in a crisis. I just want to let it sweep me away, you know? So those foundational skills are incredibly helpful for everyone. And it's all about balance, which I think is, again, the key to pretty much everything that I'm saying, which is it's a balance between your personality and your symptoms, the way you're diagnosed, the way it presents, the treatment that you use, all those kinds of things. And DBT as a treatment is basically the same idea of rewiring those neural paths in your brain to go from, in my case, the borderline place of event straight to crisis, or even, you know, in a positive way, event straight to intense happiness. It's, you know, rewiring the pathway to event paying attention, being aware of what you're doing, what you're thinking, and how you're responding. And so it's really just, it's all a back and forth balance. That's me. That's how I experience the world, and that's how the world experiences me. And I would imagine you can probably tell from like the way I talk and the way I come across that like that borderline sense to me is just about like passion. And that is how I feel like it really relates into my personality. Like the person who I am is very passionate and very like loving. I love to learn. I love my relationships with my friends and my loved ones, and the things I love them hard. And that's what people, enjoy about me. That's one of my biggest strengths. So I would never say, oh, I don't, if I could wish away my borderline, I absolutely would not. It has been a difficult and at times, confusing and painful journey at points, but it has gotten me to this really wonderful place where I not only understand how it affects me and my experience with the world, but how, as not exactly a clinician anymore, but looking out at the world, seeing ways that I can help other people. I mentioned, or when you introduced me, you mentioned that I work with families as a parent coach. And so that's what I'm doing, is kind of teaching them those skills right at the beginning, so they have an idea of how to teach their little ones interpersonal effectiveness and emotion regulation and dealing with those big feelings, because that's the human experience.
Thank you, Kyrie. Your story is just absolutely remarkable. The insight that you've had into your own personality from the beginning, I think is probably your greatest strength, because not many people have that kind of insight. Not many people can face a doctor, looking for an answer for a diagnosis, and dealing the way you have dealt with it throughout your life. The way the doctor dealt with you completely fills me with rage, because what happened in that interaction is that the doctor was thinking about himself, not about you. Right. Oh, no. I cannot do that. When in reality, our job as physicians and as providers is to be able to help guide our patients into the right decision for themselves. And
yes.
And it has nothing to do with me as a physician. I should never put into you my problems of, oh, I can't diagnose you, because that by itself becomes a barrier. It becomes a distance between you and me.
Yes, I knew that you would probably have a thought about that, especially as, a gynecologist. Women are, coming to you experiencing real symptoms and being told it's your emotions, which actually, I had a similar kind of experience along this journey. I ended up in college on a 72-hour hold at Rhode Island Hospital after a suicidal attempt. And basically the doctor at that point was like, well, you're heartbroken. So I had I had gone in and, yes, the catalyst to the event was related to grief and anxiety I was feeling about the possible end of a relationship. But their response to me was, don't see this person, don't date this person, cut them out of your life. You're heartbroken, move forward with new relationships. And that really isn't, in the moment I responded and was like, okay, perfect. My borderline self was able to just put on that show of saying yeah, absolutely. And then they left the room and I was texting this person on my secret phone underneath my pillow. And so that the discrepancy between seeing what people actually need versus what we usually think fits in the moment is the most important part of meeting people where they're at. Definitely.
Timmy, we have a number of questions.
Yes, we do. I can read one of them. So could you expand on DBT? Just want to talk more about it and what it is.
Yes, absolutely. So DBT is dialectical behavior therapy. And so when I first heard that in college, I was like, dialect, the sound of the way you talk. But no, it's not like that. So it's basically a dialectical thinking is two sides of a spectrum. So black and white, good and bad, hot and cold. And so when you have borderline, you are going from one end of that spectrum to the other really quickly, whereas most people kind of live somewhere in the middle, and there's a sway back and forth. But, you know, for me, for example, it feels very quick to go one side to the other. And so the whole goal of DBT is to help you think more in the center. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say everything is a balancing act. So like a quick overview of those 4 components. I would say there's lots of acronyms in DBT. Everything has an acronym if you want to like look them up to help you remember the things you're supposed to do in the moment. But essentially the main skills are mindfulness. So I feel like nowadays most people know what that is. I would say with mindfulness, the biggest skill with DBT, we call it radical acceptance. And so that is just completely accepting what is going on and where you're at and like the reality of the situation. It doesn't mean you like it. It's not, you know, accepting abusive behavior from other people, that kind of acceptance or anything like that. It's noticing or acknowledging where you are in the moment. So I had a moment of radical acceptance that I always think of. I was driving and I was putting on my makeup and I shouldn't have been, but I was doing it and I shook my makeup bottle and I didn't realize, and the cap flew off and makeup went all over me in my car. And I literally just like realized it happened and like just felt the flood of radical acceptance come over me and was like, I'm about to walk into work and I'm covered in makeup. And like, you know, normally in those moments, like as a person with borderline, when you experience anxiety and things like that, it goes very heightened. So like automatically my anxiety is like, oh my God, they're gonna fire me. They're gonna think I'm, you know, a slob. All these like terrible thoughts are like catastrophizing is what would normally happen. But as I'm learning about radical acceptance, I'm seeing in slow motion something spill all across my car and I'm thinking, well, this is happening. And it's kind of that, just like noticing it in the moment and being prepared to meet reality where it is. So I would say that's the mindfulness, radical acceptance part. Interpersonal effectiveness, again, they're all really kind of obvious how they sound. It's just about taking the time to think about doing them. So for example, for interpersonal effectiveness, the acronym, it's often very woman centered. So dear woman, but of course it doesn't need to be gendered. It can be applicable across the board, but we've seen more women being diagnosed with BPD because it, you know, it's with emotions. And I think people have a tendency to think of that as a feminine thing. And so the acronym Dear Woman alludes to describe, explain, ask, reinforce. So when you're communicating with someone, you might have that urge to like, you know, jump in, your emotion brain goes on, whether it's, you know, like, I love you so much, this is so intense, or like, I absolutely hate you. And so the Dear Woman reminds us when we're talking to someone to describe what we're talking about, ask for what we need, explain like the reality of the situation again, and reinforce it with, you know, this is why I'm asking for this. I can understand your perspective. So it's that balance of my perspective and your perspective for interpersonal effectiveness. And similarly with distress tolerance and emotion regulation, I would say those are two sides of kind of the same coin. One is just like the general and the other one is more in the moment, where emotion regulation is eating food that you know makes your body feel good, getting exercise, getting sleep, taking your medicine. And then distress tolerance is having a crisis plan, knowing what I'm going to do when my makeup bottle goes spraying across the car and I want to die on my way to work. You know, like what am I going to do in those moments? How am I going to remind myself, hey, you're way over here. You probably can't get all the way over here, but how can we move it back to the middle? And so really that is what dialectical behavior therapy boils down to, is always how can we meet ourselves in the middle? How can we meet the moment in the middle? That kind of thing.
Thank you so much for explaining that. You explained it very, very thoroughly. We have 3 questions that all address stigma. And so one of them, I'm trying to see if I can touch on everything. One of them has to do with how do you personally address, you know, stigma associated with the disorder. And the second question had to do with, you know, awareness, that creating awareness might not be enough. Is there extra steps that needs to be taken? And then the third question has to do with labels. Like, would you say that labeling personality as a disorder in general is actually damaging?
That's a great, so the last, I mean, all of them are obviously good questions, but that last specific piece, I think it's, when I say it's all a balance, like I was thinking about like, do I want to say labels are harmful? But for me, understanding like why my emotions are going haywire, it was like I said, like putting on glasses for the first time. So, like I think people who they're, when you own your labels or in certain ways, it's all relational. So that label helped me understand, but to then have someone label me as like a borderline person, that label is unhelpful. And so especially like, with this like DBT background, doing it for myself and with people that I work with for a long time, when people ask questions that have two answers, for me the answer is almost always both. So like, are labels harmful or are they helpful? Well, realistically, the answer is both. And I think that just means we have a responsibility to examine the way that we're interacting with those labels in any interaction, whether it's, what's the purpose of me giving you this diagnosis? Is it to, label you and get you out the door? Or is it to help understand your perspective of your symptoms? Those kinds of things. So I think in terms of whether they're good or bad, it's all a balance, and it really just depends on how we approach it. In terms of the stigma, again, I don't have a super great answer in terms of how we like get rid of the stigma. I don't know. Maybe we need like personality disorder awareness week or month or something. But I do think one of the biggest things is just talking about it. And I think similar to you guys with Oriel, we're talking about antisocial personality disorder and things like that. And she was saying, well, 20% of the population could be labeled with that, right? And we're like, oh my gosh, because we're ingrained in society to like associate like sociopath, psychopath, killers is like what I feel like the media tries to ingrain in you as being similar. And so when you think of borderline, you think of Girl Interrupted, and those kinds of like toxic, manipulative things. When really that's, it's a huge chunk of the population experiencing what really just boils down to a difference in the way you experience emotions. So I think in terms of the stigma, just being honest about it, and, even I'm super honest about it, which is, of course, hard in itself because not in a clinical manner again anymore, but, like I conduct myself as a business professional, and then like it's really vulnerable to know that like, people know that I have like a meltdown or that I have a personality disorder, because they then, are they looking at me and thinking, oh my gosh, she's too intense now that I know this. And so even being open about it, I think is the most important part. And even still, people will still ask me like, oh, can I tell someone else that you have borderline? And I'm like, of course, like shout it from the rooftops. Like, yes, I want other people to know that it's regular people. And the same thing with being antisocial, any of those types of disordered personalities. People are not just, dark or evil or those kinds of things. We're totally regular people with regular strengths and weaknesses. We have a certain lens on the way we experience the world, and it takes a little bit of, neuro rewiring on our part to make it so that we are behaving, respectfully. Of course, it's still my responsibility not to be manipulative, not to be an abuser and things like that. But yeah, it's all that kind of balance.